Hey kids, it's your dad here. Just letting you know that this particular episode has some adult content. We get into some pretty triggering topics in the second half. If you have access to a computer or whatever you're using to listen to this podcast, drop a search for Sorry Baby and just make sure that if there's anything about that movie that might be kind of triggering to you, that you maybe steer clear of this particular conversation, if that applies to you. All right, cool. Enjoy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Zeitgeist. I'm your host, Nivel Baz, and today, joining me from across multiple ponds and rivers and other ponds is my ice cream making co-host, Jordan Conrad. Wah, 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 wah. Today, we're gonna do our end of the year episode, which is a really important one. And we have a tradition here in Zeitgeist, a very, very important tradition, where we cover the most important, the most artistic, and the most celebrated movies of the year that are probably going to be nominated for Oscars. So, today, we are going to cover Demon Slayer Infinity Castle and Chainsaw Man Rise, because this is obviously an anime channel now.
Oh, Niv, I have a problem here. I don't see any of this on my notes. I see something, unfortunately, I see something a little more depressing, to be honest with you. I prepared for an A24 movie podcast. Would we be able to pivot on this?
No. Anyway, back when we were with Tanjiro and Denji. Okay. But it should be, like, let's be honest here. It would be crazy if the Academy doesn't nominate one of those two movies, because the Golden Globes already nominated Infinity Castle, which was nuts. But yes, today we're actually really seriously going to cover Sorry Baby, and if I had legs, I'd kick you.
Thank you so much. The A24 classics of this year, as opposed to the Sony classics, aka Crunchyroll classics, aka two movies that made, I think, double the box office of either one of these movies.
Not just double, I feel...
But not...
100 times
but
more.
Not dissimilar. Yeah, not dissimilar. I heard somebody compare Reze arc from Chainsaw Man to Before Sunrise. Did you see that comparison when you saw the movie?
There is something to be said that it is like star-crossed lovers. That's the entire trope that they're pulling in that movie. And I think it's a very, it's a trope that stands the test of time, because so much of, what's funny is that I always remember our Chainsaw Man episode that we actually did alongside Demon Slayer. It's crazy how it's gone full circle this year. But I very much remember sort of your exploration of the whole motivation of that show. And it was Denji's id. And that's what you loved in terms of what made that.
Oh, still do.
Yeah, that's what makes the show work. That's the whole narrative engine, his id. And I think very much focusing an entire movie just on that engine was so brilliant. And I even told you when I was watching it, it's, as you knew, for a very long time, that was my favorite arc. I had read the manga. I was very excited to watch the movie. I think I even told you this is the most, out of all the movies out this year, I was the most excited for this one, which is insane. Especially when you do a culture podcast. But, at the same time, I even told you after I had watched it, it was I much prefer the first half of that movie, because it was very much focused on the teenage star-crossed lovers sort of vibe that it was pushing. And I really enjoyed that, because it very much felt like I was watching a movie versus watching an anime movie. And I've always told you that's part of the reason why I love anime so much, is that the best of anime doesn't feel like animation. It just feels like drama that has been animated.
Well, and at the end of the day, that's what I think you and I are both collectively really interested in, is a kind of emotionally grounded high-stakes drama. So whether that is an A24 movie or whether that is something animated, I think that we more or less treat them as the same cultural moment because that's what they are to me. You know, a film that does draw from a specific center of a person's mind, I think to me feels very singular and very focused and very human. And even if you are dealing with monsters and demons and craziness, when you have something that feels like that, I think that it's not only clearly something that connects with me, but connects with everybody. I think that since we're coming to a close and you are starting off this podcast that we're talking about A24 with talking about anime, I think it would be a missed opportunity to not mention K-pop Demon Hunters, which is one of my favorite movies of the year.
Absolutely.
And does do a really phenomenal job at threading the needle between something that is very conceptual and something that is very character based.
Yeah, and I feel like there has been sort of that shift, right? Like the highest grossing movie of the year was Niza, this Chinese, animated movie that grossed over $2 billion. I watched the first one just like 2 weeks ago to understand why the second one grossed so much. And it was interesting because it reminded me of K-pop Demon Hunters, not just in animation, but also like in storytelling design, because it very much leaned into sort of Eastern folklore and Eastern culture in a way that feels alien in some ways, because some of the jokes that they said or some of the things that they did felt a little like strange to a person. Like, it's weird that I say this because I literally grew up in Thailand. I lived there for over 12 years of my life. But, I grew up very Americanized because I went to an international school. And then I literally moved to America, So it is interesting because I feel like there has been a shift, especially in our zeitgeist, in our industry, where a lot of the innovation comes from the East because it's so different, because it's not something we've seen before. So it's attracting more eyes that we're used to. And it's funny because you just celebrated like Sony.
They're the reason why I saw Chainsaw Man, is because Sony was able to distribute these anime into America. They bet big on it.
That's what I mean. The production company that actually animated K-pop Demon Hunters was Sony Pictures Animation. So Sony has been very much like owning the space lately on multiple fronts. And, we're going to be talking about we're eventually going to be talking about Sorry Baby and If I Had Legs. But it's really important to say, because you just said, oh, they doubled the box office. They didn't double the gross. They didn't even triple the gross. They 100 times the gross. Sorry Baby earned $3.3 million, and If I Had Legs earned $1.3 million. Demon Slayer, which is, I believe, the 6th highest grossing movie of the year, which is insane. It's the highest grossing Japanese film of all time, grossed $780 million. And Mugen Train, which we watched years ago during COVID, was the highest grossing film during COVID, during 2020, I believe. And it grossed 500 something million, which was also insane for the time. And Chainsaw Man, Rise Arc, grossed $175 million. And again, both those movies had around the same budget as If I Had Legs and Sorry Baby, because, their animation, they're a bit cheaper. I believe Rise Arc in particular was only $5 million or less, something like that, which is, what indie movies are now unfortunately made from. That's sort of the benchmark of essentially low budget films, where it's between 1 million to 5 million. And K-pop Demon Hunters, the budget was 100 million plus. But again, it had Netflix money. It had Netflix distribution. So, I feel like animation, we talk about this a lot on our pod, but I feel like animation is finally, after years upon years being sort of this understated art that people have looked down upon, a lot less people are looking down on it. Because K-pop Demon Hunters in particular was the most watched original title in Netflix history, with 325 million views. You look at Chainsaw Man, you look at Niza, which is a movie that I haven't talked enough about because I haven't watched the second movie yet. And also Demon Slayer. All of those movies are animated movies that are very much focused from the East. K-pop Demon Hunters in particular is the only one that has a more Western production attached to it. All the other three, they're all East productions. And they're making big swings, especially with the Paramount Netflix, bout of the century over Warner Brothers. we've had this huge conversation that theaters are dying, especially after COVID, especially after the strikes of actors and writers, essentially shrinking the industry even more, and all these big buyouts of studios. Essentially, streaming has become the future, but the things that are bringing people to watch movies now are movies that really challenge people in ways they've never expected, but a lot of it is animation. Like the other big movie on the grossing list is Zootopia now. So you have 3 animated movies that are forcing people to go to cinema. And then the second highest grossing film is a live action version of an animated film, which is Lilo and Stitch, that grossed like $1 billion. So that's what I mean. Like, it's like a weird place to be at because it is different. There is a change. And a lot of it is something that I'm excited about because it has to do with animation. But a lot of it doesn't make me feel comfortable that the big thing bringing people to seats is like their children versus like people who want to watch like good cinema now.
You've given me a bit of a difficult job trying to pivot this, but I think I have a way to do it. And just to say that the animation industry is a global one, and more the live action industry is shrinking. And the live action movies that the IP driven storytelling once relied upon is no longer a guarantee. And a lot of these movies aren't performing nearly as well. In China, you just mentioned Zootopia. That's kind of one of the main ones. And largely, the East is, I think, dictating more and more how the West is creating their work. I say this because, and I don't need to get into logistics of why we're not covering Hamnet, but I was listening to the director Chloe Zhao on a podcast discussing her ethos for making more and more accessible movies rather than making esoteric stuff like The Rider or Nomadland, which she won the Best Picture for in 2020. But you also have now Eternals and Hamnet, the most recent one, which for several reasons we're not going to cover today. I think the main one I want to focus on is the fact that I believe If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You is largely more successful at similar aims. And I also want to showcase that there is a broader shift that Chloe Zhao is a part of. She is working on a Buffy adaptation for the modern age, and I think Buffy has it's one of the 90s shows that really took a lot of inspiration from the then growing movement of anime in the West, which was at that time still very, very small and really only broke out in the 2000s when you and I were growing up. So it's, I think, important to note that there is this huge chasmic divide between the West and the East that is slowly growing further and further and further closer to each other. Now, I don't think they're next to each other by any means, but it's really getting smaller by the year. And I do think that largely what we're discussing today feels more in line with the Western tradition, but I don't think that it is completely separate from it either. And I think that the work that Chloe Zhao was doing in Hamnet was definitely in a particular style and a particular viewpoint, which you could fully pull back into the East Asian cinema of things like Uzo or, take your early black and white Chinese director of choice, something that feels very simple and meditative, and at the end of the day, sometimes very small. They call that slow cinema, but I think equally important. If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You isn't slow, nor does it feel particularly subtle, and I think largely because of Mary Bronstein, who is an interesting figure in a lot of ways, right? I mean, so you and I both really liked Uncut Gems, which she was a part of. We watched that, I think it was right around COVID. She and her husband, his name is Ron, they were instrumental in the creation of that movie. And I say this because that movie feels uniquely stressful, and in the world of If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, she's kind of taken that into a whole new dimension. And largely because of the central performance, which is Rose Byrne. Now, this movie doesn't happen without Rose Byrne. Bronstein spent 7 years developing the film, rooted in her own experience caring for a sick child. And you really feel watching the film this tension that she's working through. Not quite, I would say, therapy art, but it is something that definitely feels like it is a single experience of a person being transformed into a new work of art. And I do think that the methods of transformation are revelatory enough that it works as a movie for me, although a very difficult movie to watch, and I don't know if I could ever watch it again. I don't know if you feel the same way, but the investment that she has in this material allies no easy answers and does not ally anything that resembles this kind of neat or cut and dry thing that sometimes these movies, I think the ones that fail, rely most upon, which is if you are trying to over universalize something that feels very specific, I think sometimes you lose because I mean, we were just talking about anime, which is often so specific beyond belief. These like big worlds, the world building within some of these shows, but you connect with it not because of the crazy worlds, although those might be enticing to you initially, but it is actually the characters at the end of the day. But I wanted to ask you, Nif, so what was it about If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You that drew you in initially? Was there any exposure that you had outside of our conversations about this movie that drew you to it?
At first, and this is like the double-edged sword of us talking about it so much before me watching it, because obviously we had this period, where we talked about, okay, we watched Sorry Baby. We knew that was going to be part of our docket for this episode. And we didn't exactly know what to pair it with because we had a lot of options. We had Hamnet, we had If I Had Legs, and obviously the Julia Roberts movie as well that I'm forgetting the name of.
After the Hunt, which I will absolutely have to make some comparisons in the second half. Unfortunately, not very flattering, but I do think that it's important to discuss sort of the broader trend going on here because this is a movie about kind of trauma too. It's not an easy type of material to deal with.
That's what I mean, because we specifically chose those movies because our theme for this episode is trauma. And that's what I wanted to very much hone in on, because obviously you brought up the idea of motherhood as like a possible theme for this episode. Like, if you guys have been listening to our pod, we've been doing this for years. This has sort of been our thing, where each episode has like a specific theme that connects both the movies or both projects that we're covering together, because they're not all movies.
And this isn't the first time we've covered motherhood either. I think The Lost Daughter is the most seminal episode of our early catalog.
Absolutely. It's my favorite episode that we've ever done.
Still one of my favorites.
Yeah, mine too. It's literally the episode where I was like, okay, this feels right to do. Like, this podcast feels right to do. And I am very happy to say that. But, it was Spencer and The Lost Daughter. And it also dealt with like the grief of motherhood, but specifically having to do with motherhood. In particular to this episode, and especially with If I Had Legs, the grief isn't from motherhood. I would argue it isn't that at all. I would just argue that it is just about feeling alone. That's where so much of that trauma is, feeling alone and not knowing what to do and feeling overwhelmed. And I think that it pairs quite nicely with Sorry Baby, because whereas If I Had Legs is a very loud, uncomfortable grief, Sorry Baby is a very quiet, uncomfortable grief. And they both are having to do with like dealing with something that feels traumatic. And with If I Had Legs, this is what I mean. This is what I was like gearing up to say, which is I feel like when we were talking about it, you amped it up too much for me, because I was like, okay, it's about a mother taking care of a sick child. But in my mind, when I thought about like sick child, I imagined the child being terminal, which is a terrible thing to laugh at. But the reason I'm laughing at it is because when I saw this movie, like the child has a health issue, but it's not a life and death danger, a sort of life issue. It's not necessarily a sickness. Like, it is bad. It is genuinely bad. And it does affect the child and the mother's character very negatively. But at the same time, I just felt like, okay, there's a weird juxtaposition here where Rose Byrne's character is really, really, really like going off the rails in response to this. And some of it feels unwarranted because the child acts like an adult in a couple of scenes, which I loved, even though there are other times where she's freaking out in like a really uncomfortable way. But it goes back to what I just said in the very beginning. Her grief, her rage, her trauma is not geared towards a child or what's happening to the child. It's geared to something much more internal in her character, and it just deals with like this insane amount of loneliness. that she's actually going through. That's like the real traumatic thing. Taking care of her child is probably the catalyst, but everything else is like the actual cause. You know, when I got to thinking about it that way, it made me appreciate the movie more, because again, it goes back to the theme that we're doing, which deals with personal trauma. And personal trauma is that it's personal.
I do have to push back a little bit on the sickness part. That said, before you do that, I do want to also just make a demarcation that I don't think we're going to talk heavy spoilers. I don't know if this movie is necessarily spoilable, but I think as we are digging into this conversation, there are certain things that I think we're just going to end up bumping onto that I wouldn't feel good about not putting some kind of spoiler warning on, because talking about this movie, talking about the daughter, talking about Rose Byrne's personal journey throughout the movie, these things I experienced with very little before. And going into that movie blind, I think helped me to experience it the right kind of way. So I will give this note now, which is that because both these movies are A24, I know that Sorry Baby is currently now available to stream on HBO Max. I have no doubt we'll get in a little into spoilers similarly in the second half, light spoilers in regard to what we know as the premise of the movie. And I really highly recommend you watch that one because it is one of my favorites of the year. If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You was very difficult for me, and so I don't know if I can call myself enough of a masochist to say it was my favorite, but I do think it is a very well-made movie. I think it is one of the best made of this particular. I think it is one of my favorites, not necessarily my favorite. That probably goes to sentimental value, but it is very close up there, and it is worth exploring on its own accord. It is currently available on VOD. You can watch it on your video-on-demand platform of choice. It will very likely soon, maybe even by the time this episode publishes, maybe shortly after that, be available to stream on HBO for your pleasure. So on that note, you were talking about the stuff outside of this particular engine, which is the sick child. And it's absolutely true that we are more concerned with the neuroses of the character named Linda than the actual thing at hand. But I do want to note that having this issue actually be one that is pretty personal to me, having I wouldn't say a biological family member, but it's sort of a symbolically biological family member who has dealt with this, and I have grown up around a child sick in the way that Linda's child is sick in the movie. I think that this story is very deeply personal, and I think it affected me in a unique way. It was upsetting in a way that I did not find many of the other movies to be equally, minus probably Sorry Baby. But the way in which it tells the story, I think, has a level of humor to it that I really do appreciate. And I think you're absolutely right that it is less about the fact that the child is ill and more about the fact that Linda is woefully unprepared to apply a level of care to another human being the way that she has to. And it has also a lot to do with the fact that she feels so alone in this space.
It's crazy because of her day job as well. I was so off-put by what you said. She's so ill-equipped to deal with another human being or to take care of another human being. I know that we're jumping the gun a bit, but the biggest plot twist for me was understanding what her job was, what her day job was. That was the moment that made the movie for me.
I think we're going to fall into this, so let's just say it. So, and I also think that this aspect is largely what makes her a likable and dynamic character for me. I always think back to the first rule, I call it the Doctor Doctrine, Pete Docter of Pixar. The first rule of the Pixar storytelling is that you admire a character more for their attempts than their successes. And attempt she does. She is attempting to be a functional human being, and not just a functional human being, but a functional therapist. She is a therapist to other people. And yes, I mean, that is the humor of the story, isn't it? That not only is she someone who is struggling with her own mental illness, but she is struggling while trying to take care of so many other people who are also in turn less well equipped in her practice than her daughter is, who you mentioned can often feel like a adult, someone who is growing up on her own because her mother is not able to take care of her the way that she should. It's funny because I think that this is a relatable aspect. I think that there are plenty of adults, plenty of parents who can expend this immense emotional energy towards other people, but when it comes to their own home, they've drained themselves out. And so, of course, that causes Linda to deteriorate and become this fireball, this destructive force. But let's speak to the therapist aspect. I mean, one of the best parts about the movie is everything that takes place in the therapist's office. And not only her, but her therapist, too.
Played by Conan O'Brien.
What did you think about Conan's performance?
He's an amazing actor in this. Amazing. Because he forcibly, and I've met Conan through chance. Like, I met him at the Miami airport and I got to speak to him for like 2 seconds. So much of his persona feels real because he's a very like loud and very animated person when you see him like on his talk show and everything else, that here he was anything but that. He was actually quite understated. He was actually very reserved, and he was also very cutting in the way he delivered his lines. So much of it felt hyper specific. And I was like, wow, that takes a really, really disciplined actor to do. And he's doing it even though that's not his persona, and you've never really seen him in anything else. Like, his biggest thing was writing on The Simpsons, which feels more aligned with what, you know, he does on a day-to-day basis anyway. He acts like a Simpson character just in live action. You know, like watching him in this, I was like, wow, he's actually really, really good. And talk about like uncut gems sort of comparison. His performance reminded me a lot of like Adam Sandler's performance, because you're taking like someone that you know who is high energy, high octane, and you're adding something a bit more dangerous and cutting to their behavior. Again, in Uncut Gems, like Adam Sandler still had like a manic energy behind him, very stressful energy behind him. In a lot of ways, they converted his happy energy, which is still energy, into like this manic energy. But he still had to really discipline himself in that. And I got to admit that, you know, watching Conan O'Brien do this and pairing him up with Rose Byrne, watching them being paired off was just so lovely because their dynamic felt really real and really, like, again, I really want to hone in on this word, really disciplined, like something you would see like the best of the best kind of actors doing in today's like art.
It's fascinating that it's taken him this long to have a part this major. Have you? I don't think I've ever seen him do a movie. Have you? I don't think he's done one much. I think of like
I don't think
Norm
so.
Coleman coming in midway through career and like doing a couple comedy movies here, because like he's in a similar state where he mainly has done his show. I mean, he hasn't really had an opportunity, I guess, because he's done his show for years and years and years and years, and it started off on the regular broadcast networks, and then they moved him to cable, and then he did his show for another 10 more years. So I guess he maybe has just been too busy to act, which is crazy to say that he has this talent just hiding.
Like, I'm looking at his Wikipedia page right now, and a lot of what it is he's playing like fictionalized versions of himself, essentially. That's his role. It says himself. And then you have a few voice roles, like in Batman movies, like animated Lego Batman movies, or the Batman The Dark Knight Returns. And then The Mitchells versus the Machines, which is another great animated Netflix movie. And then like one where he plays Andy Warhol in Weird, the Al Yankovic story.
Oh, and that was much more recent, so it makes sense.
But you know, it's really funny because I'm looking at If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You on his film appearances. Guess what his name is in that movie?
Maybe they say it. I don't remember.
No, they don't say it. That's the point. He's called Linda's therapist. That's his credit. So it's kind of crazy because if you look at these roles and then you'd go down to If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, and then you'd see like the role he played was called Linda's therapist, you would be like, oh, that's interesting. Like Conan O'Brien made a cameo in this movie. He didn't make a cameo. That was like a substantial role that is just called Linda's therapist.
I would argue he is sort of the deuteragonist of the movie. He has some of the most screen time. And never at a point does he feel like he wants to be on screen, which is the funniest part. Like, every time that he is on screen, he's like squirming and trying to just leave.
It's true. That's what I mean. He is very much like the straight man of this movie. That's what he is. Because as you said, like, a big engine in this movie is uncomfort, this feeling of uncomfort. You felt it, I felt it, and I didn't have as much of an attachment to the story as you had, but I very much felt uncomfortable. Like, I wanted to stop watching multiple times to just take like a break. And I was like, no, this is the whole point. But that's what I mean. Conan O'Brien, like, playing like a person who desperately didn't want to be in the same room as Linda's character, like, very much showcases what the audience was feeling as well. Someone who just didn't want to be part of the story.
You're absolutely right. It's not a film that I felt the most at ease watching, or I can't even really say that the thing I experienced was quote unquote enjoyment. I think that it is just like a feeling of wonder and marvel at how adequately this captures a certain state of being, and one that is like definitely depressed, but not a quiet, subtle depression, a very loud and mean kind of depression. It's not a film that shows mental state in any kind of subtlety the way that I think Sorry Baby often does, or with the same kind of quirkiness. It's something that is like deeply vile, and the kind of imagery that they show, like the ratty motel that she and her daughter live in because their home is literally falling apart, and they regularly have Linda just abandoning her kid to go on these long walks over to the house and just stare at this huge chasm that she's been neglecting in the home. It's so strange because it's a complication. I wasn't thinking about this until I started talking about it, but I was listening to another podcast. I've mentioned this podcast before called Overthink, about the Aztec philosophy, and they largely rely on the idea of cooperation as a philosophical principle, because their idea is that we are not enough on our own and we must rely on others in order to succeed. And ultimately, that is the main problem that Linda is struggling with and eventually has to succumb to, is that she is in fact unable to make it on her own. She has to rely on other people, and yet she seems to just refuse to do so. And it's only when those other people literally show up for her and go, hey, I am here and I'm going to help take care of this chasmic hole that has been like literally this realization of her mental state that has been plaguing her, it can get fixed in a matter of days, right? Like, these problems
are not even a matter of days, like a night. But it was funny because it was fixed in the most frustrating way possible. And that's what I was going to ask you. Because, you know, we're comparing Sorry Baby to this movie. And I feel like a big reason why the two main characters, played by Rose Byrne and, of course, Ava Victor, is this idea of environment. Do you feel like Linda's environment was actually supportive of her? Or do you feel like it actually drowned her?
Drowned, I wouldn't say is the right word, but I do think that she was consistently at odds with it. And I think in order to do that, in some ways, the world of Linda is the world that not she created, but it is representative of her mental state. And we do this in subtle ways as human beings, where we surround ourselves with the kind of people that we believe that we deserve. And it is a representation of our inner world in many ways. Like, we can only grow when we have the mechanisms and the state to be able to grow. And the lack of growth often happens because we are stuck in these vicious cycles, right? So I don't say this to blame Linda or a woman like Linda, which I think this movie is very effective at creating a real scenario that real people experience. And it is, in fact, very much a real thing that Mary Bronstein has vocally said that has happened to her. It is also notable that these people are not reaching out an olive branch, and that there is a chance that there is like kindness to be had. And in fact, we see these people in the movie coming from sometimes the most unusual place. Like, to me, the most kind person in this movie is A$AP Rocky. And he doesn't come to her, like I said, he finds her because they have some kind of shared mental state. Like they are drawn to each other because they do have a level of brokenness shared. I also think that there are plenty of people who are at odds with her because they are not mentally calibrated the same way. I think of the car bit, the bit where she is dropping off her daughter in the parking lot day after day after day. This is a repeated thing. And you can really boil the whole drama down to this really emblematic moment because she is continually told the rules of the space that she is living in. But because she is operating in her own universe, she can't abide by the rules that are being set by other people to her. She can't live the way that other people are living. And so consistently, she is bumping up against these systems who are asking things of her, who have entered into a social contract with her that she herself does not believe serves her and does not have the capacity to either disengage from or to actually come to terms with and find a compromise because she is unwilling and unable to compromise meaningfully. And so what ends up happening is continually she's like Yankee Doodle with the feather in her cap, riding into the state of conflict continually. And so you get the cop who's just doing his job at the school, knocking on her door, being like, hey, you gotta move, lady. This is what happens. It happens every single day. And every single day she has a new reason. She has a new conflict that she is up against. And because she is in this vicious cycle, it is just impossible for her to get out of it. And it's really tragic because she's in this state and she has this sort of primal like scream at all times in her subtext, which is, no, this is not my fault. But of course, when she's actually in the parent therapy session later in, this is another constant state of conflict where she finally decides to go into this social contract to actually stay in a therapy session with other parents who are experiencing this similar mental state. And some of them are actually really engaging, but Linda is not. And she refuses to because she believes it is her fault. And she says that. She says, this is my fault. But there's something inside her that I do believe knows that it's not and wants people to believe that it's not. But if you actually had someone who came to her and expressed that kind of concern, she's not willing or able to actually take that. And the journey of this movie is in so many ways to be able to find that balance. And it's magnanimous and it's uncomfortable and, not something I really want to engage with too many times, but I think that this is that version of the movie. Like this is that version of a traumatic story that I think is most effective in the way that they're telling it.
For me, at least, Linda's character lives in an environment that is not necessarily kind to her. It expects responsibility from her, especially from Mary Bronstein actually appears as a character in a lot of ways that serves as like an antagonistic force towards like Linda. She's like the doctor who's like taking care of her child and who also like heads the mother therapy sessions in the hospital. And a lot of the times she literally approaches Linda and she's like, hey, you need to do more. She's one of the voices that is literally like, you need to do more. And she has a lot of those voices in her environment, including her husband, which is played by Christian Slater.
That was a huge moment for me when he came home and I was like, holy cow, is this guy?
How did you not know?
Niv, I was taken off guard.
He has such an iconic voice.
I'll tell you what, buddy, it's because I was so enraptured in the sort of chaos of the movie. Here's another thing that I didn't notice until the very, very end of the movie. This was the magic trick that really sold the movie for me. And I'll admit that this is a singular experience that I had. And I can't prescriptively say like everybody is going to enjoy this movie as much as I did. I think this is the one that works best for me. You know what I didn't notice until the very final shot of the movie? We never saw the daughter's face.
What? You never noticed that either?
Not at all.
It bothered me from the very beginning because, again, that was the whole point I was trying to say, where my mind was so ready with the way you were pitching this movie that the child was terminal, So at first when we didn't see the child, I was like, oh, they're doing this because she's terminal and they don't want to visualize it. They want to keep it, like the trauma of that, separate. They want to let the imagination take over.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah, but if the child was terminal, she did not have a terminal illness. She didn't have, like, what I imagined was leukemia. she didn't have leukemia. She had a much more manageable health condition. Again, a terrible health condition, but one that is very much manageable and is very much set up as such. So not seeing it, was weird. Because again, the only reason my mind sort of not only accepted it, but even celebrated it was when I was like, okay, but this is not about the child. This has actually very little to do with the child. It has to do with, again, the personal trauma this character is going through. So in that way, it makes sense. The reason why we don't see the child is because Linda doesn't see the child either. She avoids the child throughout most of this movie. So in that way, I was like, oh, that's cool. But on the other end of it, it's that idea of like, okay, but why aren't you showing the child? Like, it was very frustrating because it still was set up that it had more to do with her health condition rather than this deeper thing that I felt like my brain came up with to attach itself to the theme of not only the movie, but also the episode that we're doing today. So very
you were
weird,
like, where's the leukemia? Make the child suffer. I'll tell you, if you like suffering children, I can't wait for you to see Hamnet.
Which I know is more up to what I imagined that movie to be than what I imagined this movie to be. It's not like I want leukemia for children. I just was like, it would make more sense.
Let's clip that TikTok clip.
Yeah, that's the quote of the day. Nev does not want leukemia for children.
We're all about hot takes on this podcast.
The point I am desperately trying to say here is that even the movie was leaning towards like, oh, this is something very serious. This is like something that is very, very traumatic because it's set up that way, not in terms of the script, but it's in terms of the directorial choices of how to visualize this movie. So much of it has to do with all these characters, Conan O'Brien's character, Christian Slater's character, and Mary Bronstein's character. All of them are characters that are trying to make Linda's situation actively better. But at the same time, they are so exasperated by her and her behavior because, again, she's not only not accepting their help, but very much finds it as patronizing. And obviously, in a lot of ways, it is. A lot of their help is objectively patronizing because they don't understand what she's going to, again, personally, because she's going through a very personal experience, a very personal form of grief and trauma. But that isn't to say that they are not, actively trying to help her, because I think all of them say this in one point or in some version. They all say, we are on your side. I think even Mary Bronstein's character literally says, I am on your side here. And Conan O'Brien's character, who acts as Linda's therapist, is like, look, I'm just trying to help you. And Christian Slater's character says, I'm doing everything I can from where I'm at, because he's not even there. So that's what I mean. They're all actively trying to help her, and it's very clear that they are. But obviously, because she's going up against them, because she sees them as antagonists to her own life, not supporting characters, and she herself feels very trapped in their patronizing sort of demand for responsibility, she finds herself stuck. Not only stuck, but it forces her to actually run away from her child, not run towards it. And I found that conflict so humanizing. I found that conflict so grounding. Because, when you are forced to take responsibility in the way that these characters are pushing, most people don't run towards that responsibility. They run away from it. And I feel like that's not talked about enough in storytelling. Absolutely. And I feel like it's such an uncomfortable thing to watch, not only because this is a child, and not only because, the way she is lashing out is... It in itself is so uncomfortable. But there is something to be said that it feels when you're able to just look at it. Because I think that's, again, I feel like I'm adding themes to this movie. But I feel like the movie forces you to be like, okay, if you're watching this movie, then you have the responsibility to watch it and not look away. And again, a lot of your instinct when you're watching this movie is to just run away from the movie. To be like, this is so uncomfortable, I have to run away. Same thing that Linda's character is going through. Dealing with my child is so uncomfortable, I have to run away. I've watched a ton of movies this year, and there have been so many female performances that have just been incredible this year. In One Battle After Another, in this movie, in Hamnet, from what I've heard, and obviously Sorry Baby. Really, really, really big movies that are very much powerhoused by incredible actresses. But I think that Rose Byrne in particular, she's been the strongest performance I've seen all year. Not because she plays like this manic woman, because she plays a very realistic, flawed human being, just doing her best and not knowing what to do and feeling very trapped by it. And I feel like that is very human, not only because, it's not heroic, but because it's true, because again, the instinct to run, even though it's not necessarily good, it's not heroic, again, it is the more natural reaction a person has.
Absolutely.
When they're stuck in an incredibly uncomfortable situation.
Listen, Academy, you guys know what to do. Come on. I know where your head's at. Come on, guys, let's go. Yeah, I agree 100%, 1000%. I am on board for the Rose Byrne train for Best Actress at the Academy Awards. I think that it is a viable possibility. I do think that it will have a lot to do with what the general response will be in regard to Hamnet, which is Jessie Buckley's movie. I think that it would be interesting to see Jessie Buckley go in for that. She was in The Lost Daughter and did a phenomenal job there too. And I think it's a noteworthy performance in that movie, which is available to stream on Netflix. Highly recommend. I think that Hamnet worked less for me personally, but I do think what's fascinating about this time in cinema is that there is this huge push towards expressing female uni, desperation, and sadness. And there is a kind of depression that sometimes is hard to quantify. And it's there in most of the movies that you mentioned just now, funnily enough, as well as Die My Love with Jennifer Lawrence, which I think feels very similar to this, but it's, I think, just almost like beat for beat less successful. It has like very, very similar aims. It's interesting because I think that this movie and Sorry Baby both have these like dark twins to them. And to this movie, I think there is Die My Love with Jennifer Lawrence, which equally expresses this inability for someone to be able to take help and to be able to like actually feel and express and like digest their emotions. It's just impossible for them to do. And it's like kind of like the bell jar in a way, a cinematic version of that book. And I think that it's important to note that this year, more than any other year, feels like a new romantic era and this like new gothic approach, which is so funny because we're in this such a hyper industrial age with AI coming in and becoming like this all-encompassing force around the American life. And the response to that, I think, is, or maybe even to COVID as well, because I do think that we are very much still living in that shadow, is something that is so human and not necessarily like a big story. I mean, Sorry Baby, which we'll talk about in a second, isn't like a big story, but it is such a deeply personal one. And it's one that I think really connected with me. On that note, we can move on and listen to some music, as long as you have no other beats to hit on your If I Had Legs, I Would Kick You train. What did you think about the title? Do you think it's an apt title? Do you think it's too long?
I think that it's both apt and too long. I think actually, like, because obviously I've shortened it to talk about it. I kept saying If I Had Legs.
That's what I have written on my notes too. If I Had Legs notes.
I think that it should have just been called If I Had Legs. Because she literally had no legs to stand on.
That is an interesting point. On that note, we're going to take a quick break, listen to some music, and then we are coming right back, and we are going to be talking about one of my favorites of the year, Sorry Baby. Stay tuned. Yes, this is a break. No, not the music you were promised. That involves a thing called licensing, which happens on the Zeitgeist homepage, which is on Mixcloud. I personally curate the music for every single episode. It's easy to start the episode in this exact spot and pick up where you left off. If not, no worries. Let's just pretend you were listening. And we are back. So we are now going to be talking about Sorry Baby. Just as a quick clarifier, this is available now to stream on HBO Max, and for the time being, until it gets sold to Netflix, which then it'll become Netflix Max HBO. Who knows? Anyway, Warner Netflix. What's a good name? Warner. We had Warner Media, Warner Brothers Discovery.
Netflix Bros.
Netflix Bros sounds like they're opening up a sandwich shop next to the studio. That's so funny. Speaking of the collective trauma of the Hollywood, so I'm curious, in cinematic form, what would you consider to be kind of the platonic ideal there?
Of all time?
Of a traumatic, or maybe just a plot more generally involved in like depression or this kind of zone. What would you say is like idyllic for you in terms of what would be something emulatable?
I mean, like in terms of something more modern, I think there's a lot of movies in the past that have dealt with this sort of theme a lot. But obviously, none are coming to my head in terms of like, classics. But something a bit more contemporary that I really, really liked, and I even said to you this was one of my favorite movies that I'd ever seen, and I think we even watched it together, I don't even remember, but it was Kenneth Lonergan's Manchester by the Sea. I think that in itself is...
We did watch it together.
And I honestly believe it's one of the best depictions of guilt, of trauma, of grief that I've ever seen, because that's literally all the movie is. It's an exploration of not just one character's sort of grief and trauma, but almost the entire ensemble's like collective grief and trauma over something terrible that has happened. And not just one terrible thing, really like a bunch of terrible things, like a bunch of tragedies that have almost like dominoed into each other. And just navigating the fallout of multiple tragedies just in a movie, because you don't see, like you do see the tragedies, but they're talked about in a past tense. It talks about the characters as having survived something and not really surviving, which is what grief really is, because it breaks you. That's like what trauma is. It's something that really puts you down. It literally brings you to the lowest level that you never thought was possible. And you find yourself having to navigate life post-trauma, right? And navigating through that is such a personalized experience, and there are no right answers. There are no like quick remedies to it. It's something that you're just kind of like, okay, I have a scar on me now, and I have to live life with that scar, but I have to decide if that scar defines me or not. If I let it dictate me, if I let it literally control the rest of my future. And a lot of people fall into that pit of allowing it to dictate their future and their life. For it can be a couple of months, it could be a couple of years, it could be many years, because it's still in the background, it's still a part of you. But whether it's maximized or minimized, that's really up to the journey of your own healing. And I think that that's why it's one of the more interesting thematic ideas you can cover in a film. It's not something that springs to mind immediately. Like that's why I couldn't think of necessarily like a bunch of classics for it, because I think it is a really hard thing to capture in just one movie, and like something in a span of like an hour and a half to 3 hours.
It also feels more like a contemporaneous ideal too. I mean, if you try to think back, I pulled from the ideas of the Gothic tradition, things like, classics like Anna Karenina or Jane Eyre, which do very much feature this female ennui, but it is also backdropped within a more or less epic setting.
A novel.
But in these cases, they are very modern, and they are sometimes very like intimate and small. And those can be A, really hard to pull off the top of one's head, but B, I mean, Manchester by the Sea certainly qualifies there. But B, it's also difficult to be able to thread the needle there between something that is A, capturable, like really manageably able to, as you said, tell within the span of a movie, an hour and a half to 2 hours. But also, it's like, how do you tell that story and make it interesting for the audience? How do you make it novel? How do you bring a level of drama to it that will make it worthwhile to an audience? And that's not an easy question to answer. And in fact, I think it's one that every new movie discovers a new way, but I don't think there's no playbook. You can't replicate another movie that tries to do that, because you end up failing, I think.
It's a very attractive theme to sort of cover in a movie because it's so personal. But as you said, like the two sort of references you called out, Anna Karenina and Jane Eyre, they're novels. There's a reason why it's really easy to be engrossed in those kinds of stories, because they're so personalized. You're literally reading the thoughts of the characters as you're navigating through the story. That's harder to do when you're watching a film, because it's not necessarily, as we've talked about, done in chapters that you can read for like weeks on end, but really just a condensed 2 hours of your life. And we've always, I mean, filmmakers constantly clash up against this. How much of a life can you show in a movie? And that's something that everybody struggles with understanding. If you try to put too much, then it becomes unwieldy. We've watched movies that are over like 3 hours. Like even One Battle After Another, even though it was quite condensed in terms of what it tried to cover in a story, I mean, like it really talked about two specific times, the past and the present. But even that felt unwieldy at some point for me when I was watching it, because I was like, there's so much happening that I'm just kind of like astounded with what I'm seeing, that I'm like, this is too much. I think this is 30 minutes over than what it should be, but that's due to my own taste and due to my own sort of like sensibility of like what my attention span can sort of take. But at the same time, I was sitting with one of my close friends and he was really enjoying the movie because it was sort of an assault on the senses of everything that was going on. Not necessarily something that was stressful, like if I had legs, but something that was very much like, oh, this is a movie. This is actually like what a movie is supposed to be. Like something that feels like impossible, something that's crazy, but not necessarily a blockbuster, but something that's also very grounded in authorship.
And the ennui in that movie and the problems and the struggle that the female character played by Tiana Taylor experiences in that movie, which I'll keep generic for the sake of this episode, is, I think, atomic, and atomic enough that it can be dealt with within the frame of a film. And we also don't get much of it, and much of it is still shrouded in shadow. Mm-hmm. And I think that makes it that much more rewarding for the film. Now, I don't necessarily think I love everything about One Battle After Another, or even everything about that particular character in One Battle After Another. But I do think that when you are doing it in the structure of a film, you do need something that has a clear beginning, middle, and end, something that feels unique to a person and is also small enough that it's not going to completely get out of hand. I think that a movie that really worked for me is, and I think you and I have talked about Lee Pace on the show before, but for whatever reason, I don't remember. The movie The Fall from 2008, directed by Tarsem Singh, who is, I think, still, to me, one of my favorite directors, and so underrated as a creative force. I think The Fall is kind of his magnum opus and masterpiece because it is the best character-driven story, but it isn't just about character. Tarsem Singh's real interest is creating these lush, visual, often really inspired by Arabian Nights, the original like source text of like fairy tales, not from the West, but from the East. And the catalog that the movie The Fall is this really like fascinating epic, but it's told from the perspective of someone who is deeply struggling with his mental health. So it begins this question of like, what happens when someone isn't okay, but he's sort of trying to pretend? And like, what kind of tale is he going to spin? Because it is going to affect the story that he's telling. And as the story goes on, it continues to kind of morph and change into these really interesting paths and detours because of the deteriorating mental state of the narrator, Lee Pace's character. I think that it is a true masterpiece. I think it is truly beautiful. And I think that it does both things. I think it charts the character's emotional journey very well, but I think it also gives the audience a place to buy in from. And that place is that he's telling a fairy tale. And that fairy tale speaks to his internal truth and in such a wonderful, beautiful way. Now, in the case of the stories that we're talking about today, I think that they do offer a level of buy-in because of the unique way, as I mentioned, that they are telling their story. And with Sorry Baby, you get a voice that I don't think I've ever really seen on screen before or since in Ava Victor, who is not only the actor in the movie, I say actor very intentionally. Ava Victor is, and this is kind of made explicit within the character that Ava Victor plays in the movie, they are non-binary. So they, she pronouns. And they are someone who sees the world in a unique way and expresses their journey in a unique way. And it prioritizes this level of emotional truth over a clear coherence, but as opposed to something like If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You, which is very adversarial. I think that Sorry Baby is much more warm and comforting as a movie, and I find it to be tremendously effective. And I've seen it now twice, and I found it even more rewarding the second time. So I ask you now this, Niv, what made you, this is the same question as I asked you in the first half, but I know a little bit about the answer, but I want our audience to hear it as well. What attracted you to this film initially? I know you and I have been talking about it since I saw it way back in the day.
I have the shallow reason where Ava Victor graduated from my alma mater, which is Northwestern. So I felt almost like beholden to watch this, to support like the Purple Mafia. That's what the Northwestern Network is called. So that's my super shallow reason. But the other reason was just like it looked cool. Like the trailer for it, like I watched it, there was something very appealing about it, that it felt very grounded. And I really am intentional by how I say grounded, because in a lot of reviews that I read for One Battle After Another, like talked about, again, like this is a movie. This feels like the first movie I've seen in over 20 years or something like that. I understand what they're saying, because I feel like in this environment that we're in right now, in the zeitgeist that we're in, everything is like a remake, an adaptation, or a sequel. And it's all like big blockbusters with a ton of money attached to it. And so there's a lot of expectation that a lot of money needs to be returned. And obviously, you know, like the Oscars is a bit different, but even the Oscars has fallen into that trap as well recently, especially with Netflix putting their own movies up for the Oscars and have been succeeding. A lot of Netflix movies are quite good, but it's important to say that there is sort of like this expectation that you're like, okay, if this is an Oscar movie, then it needs to be really clean. It needs to feel like an Oscar movie. There's even the famous term, Oscar bait. But what's been really refreshing about this year in particular is it feels like a lot of movies have been made that are up for this Oscar cycle in 2026. It really feels like we're going back to, all right, we're just creating to create. And that makes me very excited. And I feel like Sorry Baby is very emblematic of that. Ava Victor is a first-time director. She was an actress the entire time before she made this movie. And Barry Jenkins, you know, like who did Moonlight, an Oscar winner, which was also quite seminal when we watched it together years ago in Chicago. And obviously that was literally up against La La Land, you know, like the most blockbustery Oscar movie you could have in that year that represented everything about like Hollywood and Los Angeles. And yet Moonlight was the one that won that year, even though like there was that crazy moment in the Oscars where La La Land was announced by accident. I feel like Barry Jenkins being attached to this is very emblematic of like, okay, this is art. Again, it's funny because Barry Jenkins literally did like the Mufasa movie, I think.
Yes, so that's the thing that financed Sorry Baby in many ways. He turns around and finances this really small and intimate script, which Ava Victor had shopped around. And it's worth stating that beforehand that they were a content creator. I had seen them. I had followed them on TikTok for a good section of the pandemic. So I was actually very familiar with their style of comedy and was really drawn to it. But I would have never expected that they would have created something like this. I mean, I was so blown. And it definitely does feel that the director of Moonlight, which is a queer story, would turn around, take the check as he did. And I've seen Mufasa the Lion King, and it is a movie. The best part is now he turns the table and he gets to hold the microphone to Ava Victor and actually let them tell their story. These movies that people are now truly excited about are really not just functional, but fantastic. And fantastic in the sense that they push boundaries and they feel inventive and new. And yes, messy, but messy in a way that feels relatable. Talking about Sorry Baby, there's, a lot of angles we can come from here. In the first half, we discussed some performance. It was, I think, a pretty short run. I really appreciate both of these movies, how they showcase new talent in a really great way. And that's the nice thing about having these really kind of low budget stories, is that it's not a race to the top to try to get the biggest and best of the acting community, but you can cast people like Ivy Woke, who I think is, again, TikTok star Ivy Woke, who
I think is like one of the really interesting actors working right now, and interesting in the best way. Like there's no other actor you could cast that feels like Ivy Wilk gives. And similarly, in Sorry Baby, you have, I would say, 3 performances that I would consider to be absolutely top of the line. Actually, maybe 4. One of them is like the coolest name possible, which is an actor who shows up late into the movie. Fran, the wife, played by E.R. Fightmaster, which again, a queer actor, non-binary, they, them. E.R. Fightmaster. Also, shout out to DePaul University. I just clicked on their page. Shout out to Chicago, bro. It's very clear that these people have known each other for a minute. Kind of Fightmaster sort of plays a parallel character to our protagonist, Agnes, in many ways.
Like we talked about this a little bit before we even started recording, but like Lewis Cancel Me, that's another name in there, and very much playing a character that should be canceled. Those names are bangers. You know what I mean? It's crazy. But it's also crazy that the most recognizable names in this movie are Naomi Ackie, Lucas Hedges, and John Carroll Lynch. They're the biggest standouts in this movie, but they all play very understated supporting roles.
Well, and in John Carroll Lynch's case, who like, y'all, okay, quick pause on the podcast. If you're sitting down and you're like not doing anything, look up John Carroll Lynch, because you know this guy. He's one of the biggest that guys I have ever interacted with. And interacted with, I actually mean literally. John Carroll Lynch was a small part on Trial of the Chicago 7, which I worked on. He was on set with me. Very great professional guy. I know him best for...
Fargo.
He's the husband of the detective in Fargo. Yeah, fantastic. Enough about Fargo. I could talk about that movie for forever.
Minnesota
But he is a really, point is, fantastic actor, really incredible, been in so many movies, and he just shows up and throws a great performance down. I actually was not thinking of John Carroll Lynch, but shout out to him.
Mm-hmm.
Kelly McCormick was my last one I wanted to shout out, who is not very well known, but her character, Natasha, who is the adversary in many ways to Agnes throughout the film, and like
Victor.
Just has this level of not even thinly veiled, just like raw jealousy that she thrusts at Agnes every chance that she gets. I think that it's a tough kind of performance to give. The script also frames these characters as these kind of satirically over the top people, and it's the kind of script that like isn't naturalistic by any means, but is, I think, tremendously affecting and effective because of the goal of the movie, which is ultimately to make a Black comedy about trauma and specifically about sexual assault.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is, of course, mitigated by the storyline, which is taking place over a year. So we get a little bit of breath and a little bit of relief from something that would be otherwise really harrowing and difficult. And ultimately, I think what ends up being a really balanced movie about something that has no right being so wonderfully balanced.
If you guys haven't watched a movie, it's really important to premise this as this way. The premise is Agnes, played by Victor, she gets sexually assaulted, and essentially the movie focuses on the time span of the year after. She's still navigating through that trauma. She's still healing and rebuilding her life after that. She's a student in university, and this sexual assault happened essentially right before she graduated. So she finds herself in like this weird gap year after she graduates, still in her university town, still navigating what she wants to do. She just feels very, very stuck. If you've done a master's program, then you have a cohort, like a group of students that study alongside you, and it's very tight. It can be between 5 to 12 people. So obviously, like, she's very close to her cohort, who have gone on to do multiple different things with their lives. They moved on with their lives.
Right. They continue to grow, whereas...
Yeah, she doesn't.
Yeah. there's a level of stasis. And the
Yeah.
stasis is because of the trauma that she experiences. You're absolutely right.
That's why I was really happy to pair this off with If I Had Legs. Because with If I Had Legs, she's still in the trauma. She very much is like navigating it in real time, which causes her to literally lash out at everything and everyone. And we see sort of Agnes's character in Sorry Baby navigating the trauma, like literally post-trauma. The way she lashes out, because she does lash out, it's just a lot more understated. She lashes out with sarcasm, and it's very true to her character. She's very awkward, but in a mix of like, it's really funny, but it's also really uncomfortable awkwardness. And that's what I really appreciated about like Ava Victor's acting in this. Because again, she deserves props for directing, writing, and starring in this. That's not an easy job to do. I was asked if I wanted to direct my own project like a few weeks ago, and I was like, no, thank you. And, you know, as a person who's done a little bit of directing in their life, I wouldn't want to direct my own thing. It would be too much emotional pressure. Because that was also her actual background. She studied acting at Northwestern, and she minored in playwriting. And I say she because the pronouns are they, she.
Yes. I mean, there's like a good scene that I think symbolizes this in the courtroom later in.
I agree.
Of course, to predicate this, there's the moments of before we know everything about the trauma and we just meet the character. There's a section where we get to more or less experience the before and after of this trauma that she experiences. And then we move after that to moments where they're able to process their trauma. And in one of those sections, they're in a courtroom and they are being selected for jury duty. I think it's a pretty good and very funny moment in the film where they circle both the female bubble and then create their own little bubble, and they put an arrow between the two of them, which is a great way for the creator to more or less come out as queer to an audience.
To represent their identity. It's very real, especially real in 2025, you know, and I think that it's not meant to educate someone. It's not meant to push this person's like identity or perspective onto their audience. It's very much like, no, we are showing this character's life, this character's journey, and it needs to remain, again, personalized. I can't stress this word enough. Themes like these are incredibly personal, so they're obviously attached to a sense of identity and a sense of perspective and how these characters intake sort of the relationships that are around them. And before I get into that, because I feel like that's really important, I really want to go back to what I was saying about like that sense of awkwardness. Ava Victor's like performance was incredible because she showcased how awkward trauma is. It puts you off your axis. You know, grief and sadness. It's not always explosive. It's not always you lashing out into the world or crying or just being so incredibly distraught that you can't function. Sometimes it's just that you're going to the grocery store and you forget how to have a normal interaction because your grief is so much, you're too much in your head because of your grief, because of your trauma, that you just struggle to have human interactions because you function a little bit differently after something like that happens. Because imagine you breaking your ankle. You know, you start walking funny after you break your ankle and you're just healing. It's the same thing when you damage your sense of self, or you damage, you know, in Hebrew we say like you damage your soul, your nephesh. And it's the same thing. Her soul is damaged because of this traumatic experience. And her trust of other people is also damaged. So her social skills become a little weirder. And that is to say, like, the movie also sets up that she's already a quite anxious and awkward person in the beginning. She herself very much prefers to be a quieter person in society. But the trauma made that, like, go up 10 times more.
It amplifies it for sure.
Yeah.
And we get to see the before and after in sections 1 and 2. In the first section, we establish their relationship with Naomi Ackie's character. And Naomi Ackie is a fantastic, her character is Liddy. Fantastic actress, has, I think, not really found the true seminal performance of her career. She's been fantastic in everything I've seen. Oh God, are you gonna say that her B plot that she like held up? I mean, she did hold up that B plot in The Rise of Skywalker.
When she was riding that space horse On the Star Destroyer, absolutely.
I think that she is, in many ways, the star of Blink Twice, which is a movie that I quite liked, but I think a lot of people, I don't think it just necessarily ever found its audience. And it's, I think, a very good movie, directed and written by Zoe Kravitz, who we all know is an actress. And she was also in Mickey 17. So these are really, I think, well-crafted stories and movies, but I don't think that many of them are like all-out hits. I mean, Rise of Skywalker made a lot of money. I don't know how much it's had sticking power in the culture. I mean, in many ways, the last 10 years have been a like cultural reaction to the Rise of Skywalker, which like
Absolutely.
kind of put its flag in the sand on how it dealt with fan service in a unique way. And again, this is one of the things that Niv and I say at the beginning of every podcast is we can't talk about Star Wars because we're going to start running into the 3-hour mark. But needless to say, like Naomi Ackie has not, I think, had like a central performance that not only showcases her gifts as an actress, but also showcases like a movie worthy of its star, minus Blink Twice, which I think is quite good, but the critics didn't love it. I think it definitely has its awkwardness. Sorry Baby, I think, is truly the first moment where I've seen Naomi Ackie. And I like the first couple moments of the movie where I got to see it for the first time and I didn't know much about it. I didn't even really see the trailer when I went into it. I was like, whoa, she really brings such a great performance. And I mean, I don't think the movie works without her. Do you?
No, I don't think so either. I think she's very much the heart of this movie. Because that's what I was trying to say by comparing both those movies together. Because, again, Linda's character, Rosa Byrne's character, her environment is very patronizing. Whereas Naomi Ackie, her character provides a very warm, very understanding, almost like... It was funny because like I was watching it with one of my best friends here, and she said something that just really resonated with me, where she said like Naomi Akkie's character is so wonderful that she doesn't feel like a character. She doesn't feel human. She almost feels like a ghost that supports Agnes until she disappears and then comes back. And, you know, it was a weird juxtaposition because, like, I disagreed with her, but I also agreed with her to the fact that she didn't feel like a human sometimes. She very much felt like an extension of, like, the support that Agnes really needed and got in order to properly at least go on the journey of healing. But of course, it also presented like this really interesting juxtaposition where the movie essentially starts when Naomi Akkie's character arrives back in their university town because they both went to university together. They were in the same cohort. And she's visiting from London, I believe. And this is also set in Massachusetts, also Manchester in the Sea vibe, which Lucas Hedges was also part of Manchester in the Sea.
He's just hanging out in Massachusetts permanently.
Yeah, he just lives there now. It was really fascinating because it also talked about dependency when you are in a state of trauma, where you're navigating healing through trauma. Because your brain very much goes to comfort. Some of it is healthy comfort, some of it is negative comfort. You know, like it can stem from if you went through like a really terrible breakup, you start like stalking your ex on Instagram or social media and stuff. That is like a negative form of healing because you're still stuck in that trauma. Or a more healthy version of that trauma is like you actively filling your time with something else, like exercising or a project or work or your friends. But if you become too dependent on it, then it's not healthy anymore. So that's what I really loved about her characterization. Because she was so positive, she started almost being like negative because it added to the stasis Agnes was going through, because it almost felt like this euphoria that wasn't sustainable. And it really was that whenever her character showed up.
She was not a permanent facet in her life. Before the trauma, moving into the second section where we actually go back in time. This is, I think, a really greatly structured film because the nonlinear structure doesn't feel like a trick so much as the natural progression of the story being told. And we get like the most deep connection with the two of them when they like are just living together in the house that then Liddy ends up leaving. So that moment occurs and then now Liddy's gone and we have just the emptiness of the house in the first, third, and fourth sections of the film. But when it actually gets to the trauma of the actual like occurring event, I think what's unique about it is that we get to see the trauma more or less from Liddy's eyes, which is really fascinating. We don't get the actual event, the assault that happens, because it does happen. The professor with a actor with that is a pretty funny name, honestly. Shout out to that guy. I mean, he kills it in the movie.
Yeah, Louis Cancel Me, good job.
Just to say, like, he is phenomenal in the movie. I'm sure people have already made every joke in the book. I don't want to make light of him, but it is funny.
He does deserve like a shout out. Like, I was introduced to him quite recently in the show, the HBO Max show, Penguin. He was amazing.
I don't think I ever got to his episode.
Yeah, probably not. But like, he appeared just in 2 episodes and he was like an amazing presence. And he's been in this for a while. He's been in Boardwalk Empire. He's been in The Irishman. He's been in Killers of the Flower Moon, which we both watched together. But he came on my radar as soon as I watched The Penguin. And then when I watched this, I was like, oh, he is a good actor. Why haven't I seen him in anything else? He has been in other things. I think people are also lightly discovering him. But shout out to Louis Cancel Me. He literally did a really amazing job portraying this character. Because again, when you think about someone who commits sexual assault, especially in our day of age, of the Harvey Weinstein day of age, you think about like the most despicable person in the entire universe. And in a lot of ways, he is that, but it also treats him in a similar way that when we covered like Lydia Tarr's characterization, that he just believes it's okay because he believes that he's not doing a bad thing, that he's already having relations with girls that want him back, so to speak, or are okay with this. He convinces himself that it's okay. Similar to how Lydia Tarr convinced herself that what she was doing was okay. And I'm sure a bunch of sexual assaulters do as well. But the point I'm trying to make is that when it was showcasing the actual assault in question, it very much humanized it in the sense of like not actually showing it. They showed the lead up to it and the immediate aftermath of it, of her entering the house, like Agnes Eva Victor's character entering the house where the sexual assault happens. And then a few hours later, she leaves. And she leaves in a very also understated way. She leaves, she gets in her car, and then slowly she starts unraveling in her car. And that's when we understand, like, whoa, something really terrible has happened. But that's what I mean. That feels more real to me than showing a sexual assault and then having the reaction happen there. No, if so much of the movie is about how trauma can take a hold of you like a cancer, then I feel like that was not just the accurate way to do that, but honestly, the most human way to do that, the most respectful and authentic way to do that.
Yeah, and it's interesting that this year we have gotten, I mentioned in the first half, there's sort of like a parallel story to If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You with the Jennifer Lawrence movie, Die My Love. This movie has its other twin, which I pitched to you as an idea, which is because Sorry Baby was always going to be our centrifuge. The idea of maybe also pairing it with After the Hunt as a lesson, effectively. And I do still want to tell that lesson, but maybe in a more short form, because the movie After the Hunt, you mentioned Tar, feels like it is more or less directly in conversation with cinema that we actually have covered on the podcast, which would have been, I think, a really interesting thing to dive into, and maybe we will someday. But the fact that when I was watching After the Hunt, the movie, which does a similar thing, not, I would say, a trick, but a mechanism for the film, which is that they don't show the assault. But while After the Hunt draws attention to it and makes it be more or less a plot point because it forces us to reckon with whether we, the audience, even trust the victim in the story, which already you're creating an atmosphere that feels very different from something more kind like Sorry Baby. In After the Hunt, it is a bleak comedy with teeth, and not just with teeth, but with fangs. And furthermore, is using a lot of the same concepts and ideas that we found in May, December, and in Tar. And this is going to be a natural counterpoint because Tar was so beloved and beloved by us at the podcast. You should definitely listen to our episode about it. One of my favorite episodes of our show. The story of Tar is singular in a way. And I think that, like I said before, any movie that tries to mimic a playbook is going to end up falling a little bit short. And I thought After the Hunt was a very interesting movie, but I also don't think that it was a as formally successful film, especially in regard to a incredibly similar concept, which is how do you find the humor in something so awful and so harrowing and so difficult? And also, how can you find the humanity and truth? What I find very interesting, and specifically about that moment, you went directly to the car, the moment where we're discovering what happened. But right before that, when she leaves the house, we watch the sun go down, and we're just staring at the house. And his house, where she goes, in theory, to have her paper.
Yeah, her thesis read.
And what we end up finding out is that she's stayed there far too long. And rewatching it, I could just still feel my stomach drop. It really hit the exact same way. And a unique detail is that this character watches her leave, and you can see that there's a level of regret there. Like, this is still not a bloodless person. This is still a human being, and I do think he realizes the adequacy in which this is a terrible, terrible thing that he has done, and that reflects in the rest of the narrative. That said, this is still not a movie that lets him off the hook, but it does recognize the humanity of these people and these characters, and recognizes that everybody's experience in this terrain is not going to be a singular unified narrative, and every single person is going to have a different and difficult experience with what can be just a horrible and life-changing thing. I noted that you were not interested in covering After the Hunt. It is a similar film, but it's not one that I think has the same rigor as Sorry Baby, which is so funny because Sorry Baby already feels like a very shambolic story that is finding its next story thread moment by moment by moment. And Ava Victor has mentioned that they've also edited the movie to reflect that too, that it is a movie that did come together in some ways in the edit. But not only is the professor not a perfect attacker, quite literally, she's not a perfect victim either. She has moments where she does the right thing ostensibly. She goes to the doctor, she goes to the university, but she also isn't interested in flattening her narrative. In fact, I think the film as a whole is uninterested in the act of conflation, in giving a more coherent story, and instead giving one that feels somewhat more fragmented, but is also about the act of healing and the act of transformation. And effectively, Agnes's disclosure isn't one that acts as a confession, but it's just an act of like trying to make good on something that happened to her. It makes her an active agent too. It's interesting the way that she does a similar thing. In I Have Legs, I Kick You, there is the act of being a therapist. In the world of Sorry Baby, it's Agnes not only being a teacher, but she's teaching Lolita. So how do you feel like those two compare? Do you feel like the story of Sorry Baby has a similar bend in the way that she's like at odds with the material? Because I feel like she is, as a teacher, she's like doing better in many ways. Like she's able to actually separate the art from her real world.
If we're comparing it to If I Had Legs, Linda's character is not equipped to be a therapist, especially during that portion of her life, especially in that portion of her life that the movie shows. It's an interesting dynamic and juxtaposition when you look at Sorry Baby, and the person who sexually assaulted her was her teacher, right? Agnes's teacher, her advisor at school, the person who was literally invited her to his house to read her thesis, to work on her thesis, was the person who sexually assaulted her. And then the movie ends with her be a full-time teacher, because I think throughout most of the movie, she's like a part-time teacher at her alma mater at this small town in Massachusetts. And then she gets like accepted into a full-time job. And a part of it is the fact that she's uncomfortable with it. She's uncomfortable with being even more tied to the school because of who assaulted her. And then it's even, the movie ups the ante where the office she gets is his old office because he's not there anymore. And he wasn't fired either. He just moved on to a different school or to further his own career. So there was no real ramification put against him. There is even a scene that the school administration tells her, like he's leaving anyway, we can't do anything. And Agnes is even more distraught because she's just like, wait, there's no consequences to his actions. And that felt, again, very real, because in these organizations, the consequences they can dole out are limited into what they can actually do. If the person is no longer in the organization, they can't really do anything. And so watching her circumnavigate in that space and remaining static in that space, but somehow, exiting that cocoon that very much trapped her into something that she can actually take control of, was very empowering, because she actively not only chose to remain a teacher, but she was like, okay, this happened to me. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. I won't do this to any of my students. I want to teach an example. I would rather do it the right way, actually support kids in this school, in this program, who are studying the same thing I studied with a lot of passion, and support them without, having my own nefarious agenda behind it. Whereas with Linda in If I Had Legs, she doesn't take that example. She falls back on it in a lot of ways. She uses that as another form of comfort, but never moves beyond it. She doesn't have like an epiphany through her therapy, which is fascinating, because that's the whole point of therapy, right? To pursue a pathway forward. But even Conan O'Brien's character is so exasperated because every time he offers her advice, she not only refuses to do it, but she asks, not even the crazy question. She just straightforwardly says, just tell me what to do. And he's telling her what to do. She's just not listening. She doesn't have the power to actually move forward. Whereas Agnes does. But again, it's important to say that Linda is still in her trauma, like in the traumatic experience she's going through, very much at the height of it. Whereas Agnes's character at least had the grace of like being a year out of it. That's not to lower the traumatic experience she's going through, but every healing journey is different. And it's a lot easier to navigate it when you're at least given the tools to navigate it. Agnes has purpose. She has like a supporting environment, and she's keeping busy in like a healthy way. But again, a lot of the movie challenges her to move forward on her own. Every human being, not every character, but every human being needs to find their own time to move forward with their healing, because healing is very personal and it's not on a schedule. It's very much whenever you're ready to do it and whenever you find the strength to do it. And finding that strength can take a heck of a long time.
Oh, man. And what I think you've done is so beautifully threaded the needle into the final act of the film, where forward momentum does really become a major factor. And I think that Sorry Baby lands the plane there beautifully. I mean, I love the ending of If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You. I really revel in it to a point where we hadn't talked a whole lot about it, and I wanted to keep it that way because I think what really makes that movie magical for me is its ending. And I think that Sorry Baby is magical top to bottom. I think that there is, and I really do mean magic, like a level of care and detail that can only occur with specific choices being made towards a larger goal, with a supportive platform of fantastic creatives that have all come together and made this beautiful film. And that really cements it to me in the iconography of this year, and it's one that I'm going to remember for many, many, many years to come. And furthermore, the actual message of the movie being one of competence, of true competence, that like Agnes is truly able to overcome this, but that they just need time to sit with it and digest this horrible thing that's happened to them. And you mentioned a key detail, which is that it was someone who had immense power over her within the academic institution, and that he doesn't even get much in the way of punishment. And one more detail that I want to note is the framing device as we close out our story of depression and trauma within the world of A24, is that we also get the framing device of children in both. And children are a huge part of not only these two stories, but of most of these stories. Of the story of Hamnet, certainly. I mean, it's named after a child. Of the stories in One Battle After Another, I mean, the child is like the plot engine in One Battle After Another. And I'm just sort of curious, and I don't know if I even have the answer, but I would love to be able to pose it just sort of more broadly about the relationship between this child and this feeling of loss. And I wonder exactly what it is about children that we use as a counterpoint to depression. Maybe it's too big of a question. Do you have any insights on it?
I mean, Manchester by the Sea did the same thing, right? Again, Lucas Hedges, who we didn't talk nearly enough about in this movie because he was great. Even that movie, like Casey Affleck's character is forced to confront his trauma and his grief by taking care of Lucas Hedges' character, his nephew, who's like this teenager who recently lost his father, Casey Affleck's character's brother. But it's very similar to If I Had Legs and Sorry Baby. Like, there is this sense of like that responsibility over another human being that's very pure is sort of what navigates you through purifying your own trauma, not fixing it, but very much cleaning it. With Sorry Baby, I mean, the movie literally ends with Agnes holding a baby, a newborn, and, you know, finding the comfort to actually speak freely to her, and also apologizing to this newborn that she enters a world that is unpure, that is hurtful, that can create trauma and grief and pain that this newborn, will most likely have to navigate through like everybody else will, and everybody else does. And I thought that was so beautiful because we talked about titles earlier and how If I Had Legs, I'd Kick You was a really long title, and it really only needed If I Had Legs, in my opinion. But Sorry Baby is so powerful because it talks about sort of the impact this movie leaves you with, like the legacy of trauma and grief and pain, and how when we talk about it, it should not just be a cautionary tale or something that a boogeyman we should be afraid of. It should just be what it actually is, a part of life that is oftentimes inescapable, but not unhealable and not unnavigatable.
Well, and children also represent new beginnings, right? If you wanted to get kind of professorial about it, they are in some ways a representation of a new chapter in which both Sorry Baby and If I Had Legs represent by their clothes. And speaking of new beginnings, we are ending off another great year here on Zeitgeist. By the time you're listening to this, we are getting our party hats and 2026 goggles ready for the new year, and may it be better than this last one politically. So on that note, we are ready for another really great year of Zeitgeist going in. You all will see us very soon. We will be back on March 8th to discuss the TV shows on Netflix about more or less young people with Cobra Kai and Stranger Things. Right, Niv? You ready? You on board with that?
For some reason, I imagined it to be The Pit and Industry.
We'll be covering that very soon. Those shows are coming a little later in. On that note, thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed us, please do tell 2 friends about our podcast. Share it with people directly as much as possible. This is a great podcast for word of mouth, for people who are really invested in great stories, because that is something that we have been looking to curate, and we are going to continue on Zeitgeist. This is a curational podcast, and if you like our curation, feel free to let us know. We are on Instagram at Zeitgeist Pulp. Feel free to give us a follow there if there's something that you have curated in your own watch list that you feel like deserves our attention, that is in the cultural zeitgeist. Do let us know right there. I have been your co-host, Jordan Conrad.
And I am your other co-host, Nivel Baz. We're signing off to say
Happy New Year! We'll see you guys all in March. Enjoy yourselves, stay critical, and we'll see you again soon.
And stay Zeitgeist.